Good morning. Welcome to the Council of the Americas for our program today on energy transition in Latin America and the Caribbean. My name is Eric Farnsworth, the host of your program today. I work here at the Council of the Americas in Washington, and it's a real pleasure to have all of you joining us for this very important conversation that we'll be having over the course of this coming hour. We have a terrific lineup of speakers who have joined us, and we'll get to them in just a moment, beginning with the Minister of Energy of Uruguay. But first, I want to express our deep thanks to all of you who have worked with the Council of the Americas in the past year as we continue to raise these very important issues to a wider audience. As the recent COP27 discussions clearly showed, Latin America and the Caribbean are natural partners for the United States, and we are natural partners for the region. And even as global and domestic distractions multiply, the Council of the Americas continues to be at the very forefront, highlighting the importance of the Western Hemisphere to achieving prosperity and security here at home. Thank you to all our members and friends, senior officials, and public and private sector leaders who have joined us this year, and especially to the Chevron Corporation, whose generosity literally makes this program possible today. We are truly thankful for your support. Our program, in the immediate wake of COP27 and the brutal Russian invasion of Ukraine, focuses on the potential of Latin America and the Caribbean, a diverse region with significant energy resources, to be a leader in global energy transition efforts. Energy demand is rising worldwide, and governments will need to find new ways to meet the needs of their citizens, including availability, affordability, and sustainability. There are no easy answers, but the Western Hemisphere must be part of the solution. To understand why, we'll hear first from the Minister of Energy of Uruguay, Omar Paganini, to discuss views on these topics from Montevideo. He'll be followed by Julie Mulkerin Ortiz, discussing how a corporation like Chevron is viewing these energy transition issues. After Julie concludes her remarks, we'll then follow with a panel discussion featuring Energy Department Deputy Assistant Secretary Beth Urbanas, IDB Infrastructure and Energy Sector Manager Ariel Yépez, and Sean Porter, who's the Director for Development and New Businesses with the Corporación Multiinversiones in Central America. All of their biographic information is available on their website, and it's linked to this Zoom presentation, so I encourage you to avail yourself of that information as well. Let's turn to Minister Paganini. Mr. Minister, we are so delighted to have you again with us here at the Council of the Americas, this time virtually, and we appreciate you taking the time to join us. Uruguay is already well along the path of energy transition. Tell us how you're doing it, and perhaps more importantly, why you're doing it. Minister Paganini, thank you for joining us.
Well, thank you. It's a pleasure for me to be once again with the Council of the Americas. I hope you're hearing me well. I want to thank you for the invitation, and it's a very good opportunity to reflect on the challenges that our nations face when they come to achieve decarbonization to mitigate climate change, and doing this with energy security and special care in the promotion of a fair energy transition. As everybody of us is conscious, it's a very big challenge for the whole world, and Uruguay has embraced it maybe some 10 years ago when we started our first energy transition. So now we are proud to say that Uruguay is at the forefront in the use of renewable energy sources. In a way, we changed what was a problem for us, that is, we don't have hydrocarbons, we don't have natural gas, we don't have oil, into an opportunity to develop more quickly in the renewable energy side. What we did was the transformation of our electricity generation. And we are proud to say that, for example, the average in 2017, 2020 of renewables participation in the electricity generation was so high as 97%. That means that all of our electricity comes from renewable energy, and the share is 44% hydropower, 32% wind power, 18% biomass, and 3% solar as an average. Uruguay had for many years a strong participation of hydropower, and what is new is the 32% of wind power and the biomass, And later on, we started with the solar, because solar at the start of the transition was very expensive. The way to do this was to call for PPAs from independent power producers, offering long-term contracts with a take-or-pay scheme, so that all the electricity generated was going to be bought by the state-owned electricity utility, UTE. This was very successful in attracting investment from around the world, also with the participation of multilaterals such as IDB. And now Uruguay has a very strong diversification of our generation, with private and public companies participating. Historically a monopoly, now we have in generation a lot of private participation with these PPAs, and also the development of a spot market and a long-term contract private market. So that's the first transition we are proud to say we underwent with success. And now we're facing our second energy transition. I would like to comment a little bit about that and the challenges we see for us down the road, and maybe for the whole of the world and Latin America. Our second energy generation needs to expand the use of renewable electricity and to phase out the dependence of fossil fuels. Uruguay, we look at the general electricity energy matrix, still depends 40% on fossil fuels, and 66% of that is transportation. Uruguay is a strongly agro-industrial country, so transportation is very important, and it's responsible of 66% of the consumption of oil and 60% of the CO2 emissions of the energy sector. So how do we do that? How do we phase out the dependence of oil in transportation? Of course, we are boosting electric mobility for particular or individual family-owned cars. This is a process that may take some time, because we are taking taxes out of imported electric cars. We are promoting in many ways people to adopt electric cars. We are developing an infrastructure for chargers around the whole country. But of course, the phasing out of combustion energy cars will take some time, because Uruguay's life cycle of a car takes more than 15 years. So even if we change 100% of the new cars, that will take 15 years to change all the cars, for example. So it's a long-term transformation. The public transportation system also needs to be transformed, and there we have the possibility to direct the public subsidies to this direction. So that's our first initiative in the transition, is to boost electric mobility in public transportation and in private owned cars and small trucks. But of course, there's another part of the system that needs to transform, and that's a long distance and freight truck sector. 4% of the vehicles are trucks, but 40% of the emissions come from them. So in that direction, we started with the green hydrogen process, and we quickly came to the conclusion that hydrogen is possible in Uruguay only if it has an export orientation, because the scale of the projects are too big for our country. And in that direction, we started to promote the work of an institutional group from the whole government to put together a roadmap for green hydrogen that is now, since the 15th of July, is in public consultation, and will be at the start of the year be a national law. This roadmap, drafted with the support of International Development Bank, calls for a first stage where synthetic fuels, green fuels, play an important part, and exports to Europe mainly, and or maybe to East Asia also play an important part, because the scale of the project is very big, and it needs a big market to to offtake all the green methanol or SAF fuels that could be produced with this green electricity that is turned to hydrogen. Uruguay has much more energy, renewable energy sources from wind and sun that is now needed for our own grid, and really much more that will be needed for our local needs till 2050. So there's an opportunity. We have a low density population. It's an opportunity to install solar farms, wind power in the north of the country where there's good wind, good power. And of course, Uruguay has the opportunity to do it with a long-term focus because we are a stable country that has a low rate of risk from the financial markets. So it can call for international companies to invest in long-term projects to produce green hydrogen and green fuels or maybe ammonia. We are seeing that for the world, this is a path to go. Diversification has been put as a high priority, maybe because of the conflicts in Europe also. So there's an opportunity there for us to be a player in this new green fuel world in the first place, and maybe later on the hydrogen, directly liquid hydrogen distribution, but that's far away down the road. We are seeing also that South America as a continent has an opportunity to play a part in this new diversified energy market with the green hydrogen, because we are all, we have much more supply of renewable sources that we can use locally. And on the other hand, Japan, Korea, and Europe has the need to import renewable energy. So there's an opportunity, but of course, that takes us to the challenges. And if we get into the international challenge, well, the first problem is how to solve the chicken and egg problem. In the case of our first transition, we solved it with these PPAs, with national utility being the off-taker, but in this case, we need international off-takers. So we need to solve this chicken and egg problem in a global way. And we are seeing with hope the tools that the European Union, especially Germany, are putting into place to, in a way, subsidize imports from, or to have a fixed price for imports from other countries. Of course, this has a lot of problems. We had this problem that you make a long-term commitment. And of course, when you make the long-term commitment, maybe the price or the cost are still for early adopters. So there's a gap there. And this happened to us in the first transition. We are paying for wind power maybe more than it costs now because we committed 10 years ago and it was more costly. The world has to solve this problem also in a global way, and this is a big challenge. Then we have local challenges, how to manage intermittent generation because of renewables. And we did this because we have a very big reliance on hydropower that also serves as storage. But of course, if this grows and grows, in a way, the storage of a hydropower will be limited, and we need to go into batteries or other forms of storage. So there's a medium-term challenge. What do we do with managing this intermittent generation of renewables? Of course, hydrogen can be also a way to go because you can generate hydrogen also in a variable way with an electrolyzer, but that, of course, puts some cost issues also on the table. Then we have another challenges is how to decarbonize the transportation without impacting strongly in the costs. Electricity is competitive with hydrocarbons in Uruguay because we are not reliant on natural gas. We don't have, and Argentina is not being a supplier of it. But we see that in many countries, going out of natural gas and going into renewables has a costly side. Maybe not in this specific situation where natural gas is very expensive, but in a general way. We also have the problems of how to finance private cars that have a higher capex and a lower opex. We need the financial system to play a part there. We have the problem of the batteries, how we're going to solve the second life of a battery, and how to direct the public transportation subsidies to electricity. So, and finally, when we get into the phasing out of fossils, we have to think about the role of our refinery, the new fuels it could get into, how to transform it. and how to deal with also the public utility that more and more will go into depending on a distributed system where many of the generators are not owned by the public utility, and they have to maybe adopt a change on its business model. So all these are the challenges we have, and we think those challenges are maybe in a way also universal. Smart grids is an important thing to put into the utilities to handle all this. How to deal with the issue that the fuels have taxes and are being used by the government, how to change those taxes into electricity without affecting costs of the families, etc., etc., etc. So to be very synthetic, we are very committed to transformation to renewables. In a broad sense, we believe in diversification. We think we have a part to play as a producer of green fuels in the near future. And we also are very conscious that we cannot set the trend from a small country in South America. We need an international consensus on how to go. We are in talks with many countries on how to put this new hydrogen and derivatives market on its feet. And we hope that will take place in the next 5 to 10 years so that we can play a part there. And we see South America as a whole, and the Southern Cone maybe more, to play an important role in a supplier of a new diversified energy sector in the world. So thank you very much. I hope I have been clear in my exposition, and I'm very keen on hearing your opinions. Thank you very much.
Mr. Minister, thank you very much for those terrific comments, and frankly, also for your leadership. Uruguay has proven to be a real leader in the space, and we commend you and your government and the work that you're doing. You pointed to a couple very important issues in your conversation. One was the need for markets to be made around these issues, and the other is scale. In terms of broader issues. And so it's a perfect segue into our next speaker, who will give us an opportunity to hear from the private sector. So, Mr. Minister, thank you again for joining us. And we hope to see you frequently at the council, either here in the United States or in Montevideo, or perhaps somewhere else around the world. Thank you very, very much.
I'm very grateful. Thank you very much.
And we're going to turn now to Julie Mulkerin Ortiz of the Chevron Corporation. And Julie, you heard some really interesting comments from the minister, and he's coming from the public sector. You're coming from the private sector. Chevron has been a real leader in energy transition efforts. Give us a sense of how you're looking at these issues.
Thank you, Eric, and thank you for having us here today. I was so encouraged and really struck by the similarities of the challenges and opportunities that we as a private corporation face in the same ones as the public sector. Chevron is an oil and gas company with a growing new energy business and renewable fuels, CCUS, hydrogen, and offsets. We have presence across Latin America, Central America, and South America. And when I listen to the comments of just really how Latin America has been at the forefront, I think there's an opportunity to really increase the profile of those balancing of affordability, energy security, and environmental protection that we see already playing out and have for so many years. If I go back to my childhood and growing up in Central America, some of these topics were present, for more than for a number of decades. And when I think about things like environmental protection through credits and international financing mechanisms in Costa Rica, to renewable fuels in Brazil, and the role that it played decades ago, to what Uruguay is facing with renewable energy, really there's a lot of the opportunities and the ways that Latin America has dealt with some of the challenges that arise can serve as an example for the rest of the world. At Chevron, and really kind of picking up on your last point about markets, at Chevron, we're a big supporter of markets and helping drive the energy transition. And I have with me a copy of our climate change resilience report, which even a well-loved copy, I might add, but even the cover of the report is really kind of showing how we believe that markets can help drive those solutions. So you obviously need policy and technology advancement, but without markets helping to drive and really cooperation between countries and the public and private sector, we think that energy transition will be a much harder and longer road. One of the things that we often talk about in Chevron and with all of our stakeholders is that we view this as a journey, and it is a transition, not a cliff. So how do you put in place and implement activities that will help incentivize long-term system-level change? So Chevron has announced more than $12 billion in CapEx spend for low carbon energy and projects and reductions across the corporation. We have a very centralized approach where we're trying to take the business unit activities and innovation happening across the world to provide corporate funding and activities, whether that be for rig electrification in Argentina or reductions in the methane space and detection campaigns across the world. And when I think about maybe just as a closing comment, and as we frame coming back to this idea of markets, Latin America has so many endowed natural resources and has already innovated to so many of them, where you have a cleaner grid, and not only for exports of ever cleaner energy across the region, but also for production of manufactured goods and products. If what I spend the majority of my time on now is carbon accounting, and really how do you show performance of the energy intensity or carbon intensity of the products that people are producing. So when we think about that, we typically think of emissions divided by output, and kind of the natural resources and Latin America being at the forefront of so many of these opportunities, thinking about that connection back to international markets is a really positive direction and full of opportunities to showcase the leadership that already exists. So as we get into more of the conversation, really talking about the trilemma and balance of these three things of affordability, environmental production, and reliability, I look forward to seeing how the private sector can contribute more.
That's terrific. Thank you. Thank you very much. And without the private sector, if I can say, this transition doesn't happen. The private sector has to be a partner in this, and you've just explained how and why, and we really appreciate that. Thank you, Julie, very much. Now we're going to turn now to the Department of Energy, United States Department of Energy, I should clarify, with Beth Urbanis. Beth is the Deputy Assistant Secretary. And, you know, we heard coming out of COP27 that global energy transition really needs to be accelerated now to hit the targets that global leaders have set. Department of Energy is a key player in that. So from the perspective that you see it in the Western Hemisphere, give us a sense of how Department of Energy is helping energy transition in the Western Hemisphere.
Great, thank you. And I want to thank our sponsors and also the Council for this opportunity. So, you know, we see Latin America as really a core leader in the transition because they have been by far the most ahead in terms of the ability to pursue renewable energy. And not only do they have some of the highest penetration of renewable energy in the world as a region, they also have some of the best resources, whether that's solar or wind, and the things that solar and wind can do, as we heard from Minister Paganini in Uruguay, including things like clean hydrogen. And so there's a huge amount of opportunity in Latin America. There are challenges. But there are challenges that can sometimes be good to have. Efficiency is something that could be improved all over the Americas. So not just in Latin America, but also in the North American sphere. But there's a lot of opportunity to do that. And I think a lot of these countries are well placed. I do feel like, as Julie mentioned, that what is core to achieve these things is the right incentives, and getting the incentives right in these countries is challenging, just as it is here in the United States. We ourselves have been changing our initiatives and changing our incentive structures in the United States, maybe playing catch up a bit. And implementing more market-based or other incentive structures to try to do that, and that's been very prevalent with the IRA and several other pieces of recent legislation.
And for those who may be watching abroad, what is the IRA? It's not the Irish Republican Army.
It is not. It's the Inflation Reduction Act, and it has. It's also the largest funding bill that we've ever seen in the United States, and probably in the hemisphere, that is focused on the transition of an economy to a cleaner economy that can combat climate change. And so it's got all sorts of interesting things in it, and we're still working with various parts of the government to iron out exactly how it will be implemented, but it is expected that it will dramatically change and transition the United States so that it can meet its commitments on climate change and significantly reduce the carbon footprint of the country overall, including in industrial sectors and other areas as well. this is something obviously that we're doing in the US and we want to share with our partners, particularly in the Western Hemisphere, who are also our natural trading partners when it comes to energy supply and also comes to things like supply chain and infrastructure issues. And so it's a natural counterpart for the United States. So right now what the US is doing is we're working with a number of countries in a wide variety of areas, particularly looking at things like reducing methane emissions, looking at things like increasing energy efficiency, particularly in the industrial sector and the commercial sector and as well. The consumer sector as well. Well, we're also looking at deployment of renewables, although that is going fairly well in a lot of the countries in Latin America. And so what it comes back to again, and we've heard this also from the minister, is the grid and being able to get reliable grids in the region that can support variability, while also working with the transition from some of the key baseload sources that are right now available in Latin America, like natural gas, like coal, as that's phased out, but also the hydro sector and the variability there that we're seeing because of climate change. That is key. And so these are all areas we're working with countries in the region for. We have a program that we're just rolling out with Mexico that is looking at methane abatement, for example. We've got two of the leaders in the region, Chile and Argentina, looking at working with us through an initiative we have globally called Net Zero World, which is working with these countries on modeling, on testing, and on actually mapping out their energy transition. And how they can utilize cutting edge technologies or new approaches or work on policy development in a way that allows them to reduce their carbon footprint. So, for example, in Argentina, we're looking obviously at renewables for Argentina, but we're also looking at how to utilize their existing resources to do things like carbon capture, utilization, and storage, since they are a hydrocarbons producer. In countries like Chile, we're looking at a broader set of clean energy opportunities and also grid development because of the variability of the renewables that they have in Chile. We've also worked on them in the past on clean hydrogen as well, which will be key. And as we heard from Uruguay, we have two fabulous leaders when it comes to looking at moving to the cutting edge of technology, and we want to support those. We also have a very deep engagement with Brazil. You can't forget Brazil.
No, you cannot.
And I have to say, the continuity looks like it's going to continue across from the previous Bolsonaro administration to Lula, and I think you will see there a lot of the work I've mentioned before, but also continuing work in the nuclear energy space where they also have opportunities.
Beth, what's exciting about what you just said is a lot of times people hear, officials in Washington, we talk about grand schemes and plans and all that don't have any resources behind them. This has real money behind it, no? And some of those resources are actually being shared also with our partners in the region.
Yeah, so from the perspective, number one, USAID is very active in a number of these countries, including Colombia and others, in terms of actually developing markets, like in the solar sector in Colombia. So I want to make sure you understand it's an all-of-government approach, and everything we do includes State Department funding, it includes USTDA, it includes the full spectrum, including state and AID. But what we are doing specifically through Net Zero World is providing resources and access to 10 of our 17 national laboratories, where we have some of the best thinkers and the best minds, and clearly the best engineers and physicists, although I don't know if we'll need the physicists for this stuff, but we have a lot of physicists. Anyway, but on the nuclear side in particular. So, we're making those resources available to these countries to utilize and to take their own plans and their own goals and work with our experts to answer questions they might have.
Mm-hmm. Thank you for that. Yep. And speaking of resources, Ariel, we're going to come to you. Ariel Yepes is with the Inter-American Development Bank. So, we're going to ask the question about resources, Ariel, but you have done some really important work on energy transition, you personally, but also the group that you manage. And we've been very pleased to see some of the recommendations, some of the things that have come out of that. But also, the IDB is fundamentally a resource for countries in the region who need your expertise, who need the financing, who need the managerial expertise. I wonder if you can tell us, picking up on what Beth said from the U.S. government, multilateralize this. Talk to us a little bit about how the IDB is working on energy transition issues in the Western Hemisphere.
More than happy, Erika, and thanks a lot for the invitation. And it's really a pleasure, to share this panel with these distinguished speakers and also with Minister Paganini. We have been doing a lot of things in the whole region, in Latin America and the Caribbean, and also together with the Department of Energy and the REL laboratories. In fact, engagement that we have had in many countries have to do with not only working on technical expertise and bringing best experiences and best practices from the whole world and the region in particular, but also trying to bring financing for different projects that are looking forward to implement this energy transition. And also, we have been working a lot on not only on implementing policies, financing, finding ways to have more renewable energy in the region, but also implementing reforms to facilitate private sector participation. What we have seen is, according to an estimate that we have at the bank, on the needs that are going to be required in the years to come for investments in Latin America and the Caribbean. In the particular case of energy, are almost 1 point of GDP at the regional level. It's exactly 0.81%, so almost 1 point of the GDP for the whole region to be invested each year in the energy transition in the coming 10 years. So that's a lot of money if you compare that with the previous experience that is less than half of that. So it's a big challenge. We know that public sector is important in investments, but private sector role is critical. That's why we are working a lot with several governments in the region to enable reforms, regulations that enable this private sector participation. And also that, as the way we have seen in several countries in the region, that we have policies that no matter the party that is in government in each one of the countries, the policies remain in that country. And to that extent, you can have more certainty and less risk for private sector investments. We have been doing a lot on that. And positive thing about, the experience that we have had in the region is that we have two windows. We have the public window and the private sector window. When we talk about lending in the energy sector, we have seen an interesting tendency to have a higher share of private sector lending in energy compared to the public sector lending that we have had in the last 5 years. That is not the same experience of water and sanitation and for transport, but fortunately that is for energy, which means that the share and the role of private sector in energy in the region is being more important from our perspective. So that is critical to try to convey the message to the private sector that the region is implementing and adopting some reforms to facilitate their participation. And also having more renewable energy in the region has been not only part of what we have been doing in the past. As Beth said, in the past 5 years, almost 56% on average of the electricity generated in the region has been based on renewable energy, which is the largest share in developing worlds in the whole world. If you think about the commitments that governments have in the years to come to adopt more renewable energy, there's particularly one initiative that we are part of that initiative, and we're promoting that is renewable energy for Latin America. Up to now, we have 16 countries, members in the region of that initiative, and the target is by the end of 2030 to have a share not of 56 in the electricity generation with renewable energy, but 70%. So that's a huge commitment, but we are working on that. And to do that, it is also important not to have only the investments in renewable energy, but also, as Beth said, and as Minister Paganini said, the grid is important as well. Regional integration is critical. And to facilitate that regional integration, it is not only having investments there, but also to facilitate the dialogue among the different countries to enable that. So we are working on that, and we're very proud to say that we have 4 different initiatives for regional integration in Latin America. One is Yépez in Central America. The other one is CINEA, the Andean countries. The other one is Yesur, that is Brazil, Paraguay, Uruguay, Argentina, and Chile. And another one that is Brazil, Guyana, Suriname, and some countries like the Caribbean. So we have lots of initiatives for regional integration, and we think that that is part and a critical element of the adoption of more renewable energy in Latin America and the Caribbean.
That's terrific, and thank you for going over that. You mentioned one phrase which really is critically important from my perspective. That's policy sustainability across the region. And when we're dealing with private sector, we've talked about incentives already. We've talked about the need for more private sector investment, et cetera. But these are long-term investments, and you don't put capital at risk if you don't have a sense of what you might be able to see around the corner. Ariel, I know that the bank is not political, et cetera, but how do you deal with that? Because that is real across, well, in the United States too, for that matter, but in Latin America and the Caribbean. Are there things that advice maybe or things that you could give to folks who are looking at this issue and may say, well, yeah, I hear everything that you all are saying, but Latin America is complicated for investors. How do we think about those issues?
What we do is all the time, what we have to have is a dialogue with government.
Yeah.
And I think the most important and the most critical element of our contribution and our dialogue with governments is bringing the technical expertise, best practices, how things are being implemented and how things are being done in some other countries that have had a very positive impact in those countries. That is our responsibility and our fiduciary responsibility with governments. So we all the time, whenever we engage in a dialogue on how to promote a sound energy sector, is critical for us to talk about what are the best practices to facilitate regulations to enable these sound energy sectors in the whole region, but having this private sector participation to enable all the investments that are going to be needed in the years to come. So we engage in that dialogue. We have had very positive experience in the region. We have seen that some countries have adopted those regulations. They have learned about experiences in some other countries, bringing those experiences to those countries and trying to implement the best they can do according to the political margins that they have. And we have seen, fortunately, successful experiences. So no matter that, they have a different government after elections, the state policy is the same. And they are very committed to have more renewable energy and to enable and facilitate that private sector participation. At the end, the political decision depends totally on governments. But our responsibility, our role is to bring the best practices and experiences.
Thank you for that. You're watching a program with the Council of the Americas on energy transition in Latin America and the Caribbean, and we are delighted to have you with us. Thank you for joining us. And we're going to turn now to Sean Porter with CMI, if I can give the abbreviated title. Sean, we hear a lot about Uruguay, South America, Brazil, et cetera, et cetera. CMI is Central America. We don't talk a lot about energy transition in Central America necessarily. But these are fundamental issues, not just for the energy sector, but for development, for migration patterns, for agriculture. You guys have a really interesting portfolio of investments in the region. I wonder if you can just tell us a little bit about that and how you're seeing these issues, again, from the private sector perspective. And what makes this panel so interesting is we've got private sector and public sector, and we're all wrestling with the same issues to try to get to the same place.
Yeah, thank you very much. And thank you very much for having me here. I mean, the discussion has been very, very pertinent up to now, taken from anywhere and applying it to Central America. I mean, all of these issues exist, maybe in some markets more so than in others. I mean, it's a little bit of a salad of different regulatory frameworks, and getting those pieces together is one of the challenges that we have when you look at the countries of Central America. But, this is something that has been going on, we've been working at for a long time. So, and planning, energy planning, sector planning takes a long time. And I think that maybe it'd be useful, given the previous interventions, to kind of frame this in the role that the banks play and the role that the international community plays in the development of this. So, 20 years ago or so, 15 years ago or so, we started getting the PPA framework that the minister spoke of. The development banks were fundamental in getting that going. I mean, that would not have occurred. The investments in the Central American countries in the early 2000s, mid 2000s would not have occurred if it wasn't for the multilateral banks. And, we're now getting to a point where we have to become more sophisticated and to take the role of the banks and, now graduate from development banks into more sophisticated capital solutions. And part of that has to come from proving the track record of being able to do investments that bring the return that the investors are looking for in a stable environment where we're not seeing radical changes in country risk, radical changes in regulatory risk, et cetera. So the banks have played a crucial role up to now in providing that. I think that going forward, as we're seeing more private banks participating on more meat and potatoes, PPA 15 years, the development bank can play a very important role in helping us develop more sophisticated schemes, things that have been successful in other locations, and to taking this next step. I mean, Central America has fantastic resource. It has very expensive alternatives. It's not very well prepared for certain contingencies. In some markets, one plant will go offline and all of a sudden the power price will go up 200%. Yeah. This is something that has happened in the last couple of weeks in several countries in our region, right? And so we need to bring in more investment, get us away from the edge and the exposure to the expensive sources that really put the economics off the rails when we have technical problems or environmental problems or a lack of rain. We're very much exposed to the Niña-Enso variations. And the way to solve that, in my opinion, or in our opinion, is diversification. So we need to bring in more projects that are looking to sell to the regional market, that are looking to sell to spot markets, that are looking to provide energy to industrial consumers in a way that the first generation of renewable projects really didn't have. It was, let's make sure that we can determine that there's a resource there, that there's an investor there, that the distribution companies will pay the invoices and get the banks and the investors paid. Now we've kind of made that jump. Now we've about 50% renewable in Central America, and we have to move into sophisticated systems. There has been a reduction in investment in some of these areas because we are perceived to have overinstalled some of the countries. That only appears that way until we get a Niño year, and then it's not the same. So banks joining the private sector and doing more creative, more sophisticated projects, I think can take us to the next level and eliminate some of these big shocks that when we see, when you have to turn on the very, very expensive, outdated diesel plants or other plants that are very expensive on the system. And then to what the international community and the governments can do is, how do we receive that variable power? I mean, it was one thing when you had 5% wind, solar on a big grid with 50% hydro and fast response thermals there to step in at any moment. Now it's different, where you're looking at some of the markets in Central America where if you take Nicaragua as an example, at some points, Nicaragua has about 80% of its electricity at any given moment coming from the wind in the evening during the windy season. Now, as we increase the penetration in these countries, the grids have to be able to absorb that, and they need the technical expertise that can only come from the international community for the experiences that we've had in the past. The national dispatches are wary of solar. They're wary of more wind. They're wary of some of these variable resources that can be the cheapest, but maybe the most difficult to predict. And so the international community, the international banks, interested governments coming in and assisting us in designing the grids so that they can accept renewables and reduce volatility over time, increase sustainability over time, and eventually spur more investment in the region. At CMI, we just on our food stuffs side of the business, because we have food production, we have capital investments, including energy. We plan on investing $1.8 billion in Central America over the next several years. We need cheap power for our productive facilities in order for us to make those work and continue to do that. And so we need this private, push on the investment. We need the banks to be flexible and to provide us mechanisms that allow us to invest and to show the world that later we can go to capital markets and do things that are a little bit more efficient. And we need neighbor governments global governments, international actors to assist with the regulators in the markets, the distribution companies in the market, the transmission companies in the market, to be able to prepare ourselves to take this variable power that is the solution. And, goes without saying, taking advantage of the capacity that's installed now, thermal or otherwise, to soften that transition is very important. Eliminating the most contaminating technologies from the grid and using the technologies that provide firm power, regulation services, and also in the net decarbonize these markets, I think will be very, very important things going forward.
Sean, Minister Paganini referenced the need for larger markets. Ariel talked about sub-regional integration, among them Central America. Many of us have been talking about Central American de facto integrations for many, many years. And yet my sense on the energy side is we have a long way to go. And I wonder, this is your area of expertise in terms of Central America. From the private sector perspective, what can be done more to get the countries of Central America, which don't have sufficiently large markets to draw the investment you're talking about, to envision a regional approach that will provide greater opportunities for the private sector to draw the investment that everybody needs to clean the grid, to do all the things that we've been talking about? Are there insights that you could give in 2 minutes or less about some of those complicated issues?
I'll see if I can do it in 2 minutes or less, but it's a very good question. I mean, I think we are at an inflection point. So right now we're seeing reform in Honduras. We are seeing the Pacto Eléctrico in Dominican Republic that's just coming to fruition. We have electric reform that's under review by Congress in Costa Rica. We have a big public tender coming up in Guatemala. So we're at a moment where I think that some of these countries, I guess, let's not talk about the DR when we're talking about integration in Central America, but the other countries, there's a moment where I think that good advice, good advisors, technical, commercial, financial, can help us incorporate the system so that we get a CPAC or a MER, an MER, that is not 6 fragmented markets that can do business under certain conditions at certain times when all of the stars align, to compatible markets that can take the best of the region, which in my opinion, the best of the region is the market making ability of Guatemala. I think Guatemala has a very efficient market. It's very nuanced, sophisticated. You can do just about anything that you dream up there. And the renewable side of a Costa Rica that many, many years ago, 65 years ago, decided they were going to be completely renewable. And they have been very successful in doing that and have kind of isolated themselves from shock in the time. So I think that what we need to do is get all these groups together, get the EPR together, get CPAC together, get the countries together. And if we can't make one single market, we need pieces that fit together in a way that will not only serve as an escape valve for internal problems or very singular arbitrage opportunities on the trading side, but really creates a functional market where we can take advantage of the world-class hydro that exists in Panama, Costa Rica, Guatemala, the world-class wind that exists in Nicaragua, Costa Rica, and Honduras, the solar that in the entire Pacific tranche of Central America is just excellent. We have all of the ingredients in Central America. And if we're going to put them all together to create this robust, resilient, sustainable energy market, we're better off taking advantage of all those pieces. So, I mean, we need to rethink how we're going to do firm rights on the CPAC line. We need to rethink the terms that we can do that. And we should think together about, is it a good thing for the region, for the rules to allow someone to invest, to attend to that market and not the individual niches within it?
Yeah. And we have to, I mean, Everything you said, I would agree with. And there just has to be somehow a consciousness that, this is bigger than any one country, frankly, in Latin America or the Caribbean, but Central America, particularly because of the size of those markets. Well, you have about 10 minutes left for this program, which is clearly not enough to address all the issues that we'd love to. But let's keep going. Beth, I want to ask the question about the elephant in the room. We're talking about energy transition. We're talking about solar. We're talking about wind. We're talking about hydro. Latin America is very wealthy in all of those, as well as other alternatives. We talked about hydrogen. Latin America is also very wealthy in hydrocarbons, and hydrocarbons run the world right now. And so the question is, from the Energy Department perspective, how are you viewing this from a Latin America, Western Hemisphere perspective? Because, you hear countries, we just hosted the energy minister from Guyana in a similar program like this. And he said, look, Guyana is coming online with a lot of hydrocarbon wealth, and our country is carbon neutral. Why should we be penalized because the rest of the world doesn't know what to do in terms of hydrocarbons? And frankly, I didn't know what to tell them because it's a fair question for a developing country. And I wonder, from your perspective, what are some of the things that you would think about, and how do we put those issues in context?
Yeah, so I think it's a good question. I mean, obviously, we ourselves in the United States are a hydrocarbons producer and an exporter, and actually we export quite a bit of gas to countries like Brazil. So, obviously, this is a challenge that all of our countries have to face together. And particularly the hydrocarbon-rich countries in Latin America, some of which are new, like Guyana, and some of which have been producing hydrocarbons, like Argentina, maybe even longer than the U.S. So I think it's important to keep that in mind, but also to keep in mind that there are opportunities to work within the hydrocarbon space to improve the carbon dioxide and the emissions perspective. And we are doing that very seriously in the United States, particularly looking at methane as a pollutant and trying to, obviously capture the benefits of reducing leakage and making more profits, quite frankly, for companies who can do that effectively. That's something we're sharing specifically with a number of countries, as I mentioned, Mexico and Argentina in particular. I think the other opportunity for the hydrocarbon producing countries is carbon capture, utilization, and storage, particularly storage in old wells. And this is something that a lot of countries are interested in doing. Obviously, it's something that is something our department has been working on in the United States for many, many years. It's something we've been doing even cross-border with Canada for about 15 years with some of our experimental projects. And so there's a lot of opportunity there to leverage the hydrocarbon space to, number one, reduce the emissions and the impact of the hydrocarbon sector, but also to utilize the hydrocarbon sector to drive either carbon capture and storage and other clean energy, but also to use the technical expertise that a number of these countries have who have excellent state companies that work in this sector, and as a result, have a culture of engineering, have a culture of analysis, and have the ability on hand to be able to transition that from whatever they may be doing in the hydrocarbons, just as we see Chevron is doing, and take that into the renewable space. Whether that's we build jacks for hydrocarbons offshore projects, but we can also use them for offshore wind, like you might see in Uruguay, where their national oil and gas company is actually leading the way on offshore wind and also on the production of clean hydrogen. So we see lots of opportunities to leverage both the infrastructure and the companies in these countries, but also to work together as we try to meet our goals individually and collectively to reduce carbon dioxide emissions and other emissions, but also to increase reliability and quite frankly, energy security in the region, particularly for some countries, as you noted, that have a lot of opportunity, but may be very dependent because of history or whatever it is on some sort of hydrocarbons. And they're exposed to significant volatility, particularly in the markets that we see today. And so this serves a lot of purposes.
Absolutely. You mentioned two things, which I'm particularly glad you did, and I want to highlight. One is the word Canada. This is a program specifically on Latin America and the Caribbean, but the Council of the Americas is Western Hemisphere. Canada is the largest supplier of U.S. to the United States of imported energy, et cetera. So we don't want to forget our friends north of the border. So thank you for that. And second, you mentioned human resources. we think in terms of technology, we think in terms of capital, we think about, regulatory structures. But at the end of the day, if you don't have trained humans, effective, educated engineers, et cetera, we don't have time to go into that. That's a whole separate conversation of workforce development, but it's a really important point. I just wanted to highlight that and emphasize it, and thank you for that. Ariel, we're going to come to you. We don't have a lot of time remaining, but we're going to get to you, and we're going to get a final question to Sean as well. Ariel, you have a hemispheric remit. You look at the region as a whole. I wonder, is there a country or two countries or a region that's doing these issues particularly well that can serve as an example to others? Maybe not a one-for-one model, every country's different, but, who have the right principles and the right, momentum behind what they're trying to do. Give us a good or positive example or two.
Yeah, I will do so, but, I want to elaborate a little bit more on what
Please.
Beth was talking about on this, the elephant in the room, no? What we have seen is that and that's something that has been very positive for us at the IDB, is that several companies, oil companies in the region, had approached us to talk about what is going to happen in the years to come when we will have more renewable energy and our oil processing won't be there the same way that it is now. And we have been working together with some companies in the Caribbean, particularly Colombia as well, that are thinking about how to reinvent themselves the way that Chevron is doing that, to adopt more renewable energy and to think about this energy transition, what they can do at this moment to be fully consistent with what is going to happen, no matter what happens. But also in that, as part of that discussion that we have had with these companies, we have had a conversation with governments on the role of subsidies, energy subsidies, particularly for oil derivatives. If we really want to engage in this energy transition, it's really important to think about labeling, the conditions for any sources of technologies or generation technologies. Because if we don't go really to face and to tackle all the issues that we have in some countries with energy subsidies to fossil fuels, it's going to be very difficult to adopt more renewable energy. And that is also another element that is critical in the discussion that we have with governments in the region. Now, going on the experiences that we have seen on countries that have implemented successful policies, but also I will go a little bit further. It is not only successful, but also that they have had continuity, no matter who's there, And we have seen that in Chile. In fact, in the newspapers, we have seen that the change in government didn't change at all what the government is pursuing on the energy transformation, in having less carbon in the electricity generation, adopting more renewable energy. And we are very proud and happy to see that. Same thing is happening in Colombia, that they are very, committed to have more renewable energy in the generation matrix. And we think that in the years to come, they will continue doing that, because it is not only that they are aware that the potential that they have about it, but also that is something that is going to happen, that is going to be critical to face that from a political point of view. And also another one that we have seen is, Brazil. We have seen that in the last year. No matter which government was there, the role of renewable energy has been important. In fact, I was talking before starting this conversation on a policy that is being implemented by the Brazilian government on having more renewable energy in electricity generation in the Amazon basin, which is very positive, and that's going to continue because it's thinking about sustainability, it's thinking about bringing this positive ecosystem of having renewable energy in all that region, that at this moment in some areas where you have diesel generation is not only dangerous, but also is inconsistent with what is going to happen in the years to come. So we have had very positive experiences in the region, but more than anything, it has to do, I think, with the political commitment, what they want to see in the energy sector, in this energy transition, and how they can approach through policies implementing or taking different actions to move into that direction.
What you're talking about in terms of the Amazon basis, that's tremendously interesting. It really is, because, those are implications at a global level, but also Brazil's own development. And so somehow those issues can be made consistent with each other. I think we'll all be happier. We'll all be in a better place. Sean, we don't have a lot of time, for which I apologize, but let's give you the last word, and then I'm going to come back to Julie for a final thought, if she has one, for 30 seconds. Sean, you have a magic wand. You are a magician. You have the ability to make one change in the energy sector in Central America. What is it?
Political stability.
And that's across every country in the region?
Every country in Central America, at least. And if it could be beyond, that would be fantastic.
Okay, so you've just done a fantastic job. You haven't filled your full time, so let me do a follow-up with that. What would it change your view, either positively or negatively, if we were to extend Central America from a policy perspective into southern Mexico, or perhaps into Colombia, or does that just complicate things in a way that it just doesn't make much sense?
Well, I mean, I think that if you extend northward towards Mexico, the stability again becomes an issue. We've seen, some very ambitious plans and very successful results that occurred in previous administrations that hasn't continued, and you haven't seen, that building out like we would have liked to have seen. Yeah. I think that the story going south is a little bit more positive, but we've got very volatile interest rates right now. We've got very volatile cost of capital by investors. Having political volatility added to that mix, that the volatility would exist anywhere. It exists here in the United States. You add that some of the zigzagging that you've seen in the political directioning of policy, it makes things very difficult for an investor to plan their investments, to execute them, and to comply with their commitments to lenders and their end investors. So political stability is the thing.
Message received. And I tell you, this has been a tremendously rich conversation. I hope all of you at some point will agree to come back to the Council of the Americas for some follow-up. We only began to scratch the surface, but wow, the topics that we've covered have been really outstanding in my view. And so Julie, we're going to come to you and for a final thought. You've heard what our panelists have said. And put it in your own perspective from Chevron. 30 seconds. What would be your final comments?
I'm really encouraged by the panelist discussion and the topics that have been raised, because they're all things that we discuss on a daily basis within Chevron. This need to provide aligned incentives to create that long-term stability for this journey that we're all on. And how do we create that visibility into the marketplace to help provide that both inter-region and beyond? Is a journey that we're all on together. So this is one of the reasons why Chevron sponsors these types of events and want to bring together stakeholders so that we can all go on this journey of lower carbon together.
Thank you. And that's the key point. We're all on this journey together. So we're going to have to figure this out. Public sector, private sector, NGO sector. And we're happy to be the host. Thank you again for your support. Thank you to the panelists for your comments. We hope you will join us again. Thank you for joining us online. This Zoom program will also be available on our website, www.as-coa.org. We encourage you not just to refer to it often, but also to forward it to friends who may be interested in hearing from experts. With that, we are going to conclude. Very best wishes for the holidays. We hope to see you often at the Council of the Americas in the coming year, 2023. Thank you. Have a great day.